Iran has been ramping up efforts to enrich uranium. Bibi Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, says the international community must act now to stop Iran. What's going on? We're going to talk about that in a very special report on This Week in Oil, focusing on Iran, what could happen, the different scenarios that could happen going forward. So let's get into it. This Week in Oil. Hey, I'm Aaron Kildow with over 30 years of experience in oil analytics and trading, and I'm going to break down all these different scenarios for you so maybe you can sort of know what to expect in the coming weeks. Let's get into it. So one of you guys in the comments asked the question, what would happen if Iran was attacked? What are the different scenarios that we could go through? And man, that was a great suggestion. Thank you very much. I read all the comments. But thank you very much for that suggestion. It's got me thinking this week. And then we had a bunch of headlines out this morning that made it sort of urgent that I go ahead and make this video now. So let's go through a couple things. I threw this chart pack together here pretty quick. And again, I'm happy to send it to you if you contact me at theoilbalance.com. There's a couple different places you can click on there to get on our distribution list. At any rate, like I mentioned, a bunch of headlines going through between Friday night and Saturday morning. It's right now Saturday, the 31st of May. And like I said, a bunch of headlines going on here. So apparently the International Atomic Energy Agency just released a report that I've not seen, but there's been several different news agencies reporting on what they have seen of this report, basically saying Iran has been ramping up the enrichment of uranium. They've got enough material for 10 bombs. It sounds like some of the U.S. State Department saying it would take them about 2 weeks to go from the enrichment levels they have now to get to like a nuclear grade quality uranium for a nuclear bomb. So things really seem to be carrying on. There's 409 kilograms now of highly refined uranium that the International Atomic Energy Agency found in their most recent trip to Iran. So that's up 50% from the last time they were there. So some pretty serious things going on. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, made some comments, or at least some comments attributed to his office, as I mentioned in the intro, saying the international community must act now to stop Iran, among other things. Saying that they're clearly trying to use nuclear technology towards a weapon and not towards just civilian use, as the Iranians keep saying. So things like that are what's going out there. President Trump on Friday said Iran still wants to make a deal. They don't want to get blown up. So we'll see what happens with that. But at the same time, President Trump said that Iran cannot have a nuclear bomb. And then the Iranian foreign minister this morning, our time anyway, said that Iran is basically not going to give up the right to continue to enrich uranium. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of the headlines here the last couple of days. I do want to go over a couple points with you really quickly, though. One is that this is sort of the game that Iran plays, especially as they come into these, let's call them more serious negotiations with the West, especially with the U.S. Every time they try to get some sort of control over Iranian's nuclear program, things seem to sort of bound out of control and get worse. At the previous place I was working, we had some really smart guys in our global securities team. So again, like security, like is in protection. And they would always say that it was in Iran's best interest to get as close as they could to the line of having a nuclear bomb without actually going over that line. And that was the most leverage that they had on the West, was kind of getting up close to that line, but not actually crossing over it. Because once you cross over it, then it's a different relationship and different things can happen, and you can't kind of go back. You can't go the other way, right? Unless you're willing to open up the country completely and let everyone else, let the International Atomic Energy Agency in and prove that you have completely given up your nuclear weapons. And of course, they have the IAEA has a hard enough time getting in Iran to see their enrichment programs anyway, much less look at what their actual military facilities and whatnot. So take that maybe as a background, that we are leading up to what seems like fairly serious talks with the Trump administration between Iran and Trump. Um, so maybe this is just part of their game plan right now with everything that's going on. At the same time, it's not going the right direction. Previously there have been headlines of Iranian officials saying they want to wipe Israel off the map and this sort of thing. So it's a very serious situation. And you can see why both Israel and Iran are pretty worked up about this at this point. So at any rate, let's go look at some scenarios. Again, I'm coming to you from an oil perspective. That's what this channel does. I'm not necessarily an expert on global relations and that sort of thing. But from what I do know, and again, from previous jobs that I've had and that sort of thing, this is sort of how we would break down these big international potential conflict situations and start to pick them apart and look at them. So one way to do that is to kind of say, well, let's break it down between different levels. Let's say that the West has what we would call a proportional strike, meaning that right now there doesn't seem to be a huge threat from Israel or from Iran today against Israel or any other neighbors. If the U.S. State Department's right, if they got busy within 2 weeks, they could have a nuclear bomb, and then that completely changes everything I just said. But at this point in time, from what we know, right, it appears that it's more of a perceived threat, or they're getting closer to actually having a nuclear grades weapon, that sort of thing. So a proportional strike would be to go in and sort of take out their capabilities to continue to enrich uranium, which happened, I believe, back in 2015 with the Stuxnet virus that I believe was Israel was able to get into the computer systems within Iran. As far as I know, it didn't kill anybody, but it completely shut down their Iran's enrichment program for quite a while. And that's sort of the ideal situation. The ideal way to sort of de-escalate this sort of thing is some sort of strike like that. Again, I have no idea the capabilities of Iran to stop something like that, or Israel or the West to inject some sort of new computer virus or something like that. But again, that's happened in the past, and we sort of saw what happened. Iran's reaction to something like that would probably be fairly subdued. Something big enough, some sort of attack, probably on a military type target. Again, the goal would be for minimal or no loss of life on either side, but something large enough that the Iranian leadership could point to it for their civilian population and say, look, we did something, we blew up that airport, or something along those lines. And so I wrote in here, maybe the best case scenario for Iran. And what I mean by that is if something like that were to happen again, that would de-escalate the situation in a way that would still allow Iran to sort of save face, if you will. That, a computer attack is still, sort of bad, obviously, from their national security perspective. But again, no one was killed. It de-escalated the situation, to the extent that the rest of the world was sort of happy with them or felt safer with them, sort of thing, so that they could continue to trade with the rest of the world. So, of course, we have sanctions on Iran. President Trump has said he's going to continue to try to make them worse, put the screws to Iran even more if they continue down this path. So that being said, kind of getting into the oil part of that, because that's where we're coming from on this channel. Iran produces about 3 million barrels per day of oil. It consumes about 2 million barrels per day. Again, these are ballpark numbers. And exports about 1 million. Their biggest customer and probably their main customer is China. So keep that in mind. That's going to be important here in a minute. So some sort of proportional strike where it de-escalates the situation with minimal civilian casualties, that sort of thing, obviously would be the sort of best solution if there has to be a strike, and there may well have to be, given the headlines we've just seen. But at any rate, let's keep going. So the second one is a strike that may seem excessive. Again, it depends from which side of the border you're looking on, right? But something that could be argued it was excessive, but led by Western countries. As you know, the U.S. military has a big buildup in Diego Garcia. There's several fleets in the region, in the Med, I believe. Again, that's not my strong suit, keeping up with the different Navy fleets, but I think we're probably all aware that the U.S. Navy does have a pretty good sized presence in the area, as well as the Air Force presence in Diego Garcia with bombers and fighters within range of Iran. So obviously that's not that's done on purpose, right? So scenario 2, a strike sort of led by Western countries, again targeted at more military sites within Iran, probably the enrichment facilities or other targets that the West would deem as being legitimate, the possibility for civilian targets being hit. So again, something that the the world would maybe sit back and go, "Ooh, that was maybe a bit much." So then, what would Iran do? They would probably strike back at Israel anyway. Again, if there is a sort of a big military type strike as opposed to the first one I discussed, where it's more software computer driven, they're probably going to try to pin it back on Israel anyway, saying that you corrupted the minds of the Western leaders or whatever they're going to say to try to tie it back to blame Israel for the attack. It would probably lead to some sort of attack. The Iranian proxies, the Houthis and others in the region and wherever else they might be, might obviously try to crank things back up, target Western ships, like the Houthis were doing previously, that sort of thing, just to cause general trouble, and to let people know that they're not happy with the way Iran was treated in that scenario. The other thing I think we should be thinking about is that any sort of military attack would probably strengthen relationships between Iran and Asia and Iran and other places in the Middle East. Again, it depends entirely upon how big the attack is, what's targeted, et cetera, et cetera. It seems to me, and so again, geopolitical focused people, maybe correct me or send in your comments, but it seems to me that maybe Saudi and Iran are getting along better than before. I'm not suggesting they're best friends. I'm just saying that relationship maybe seems a little bit closer here lately than it did, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And then, as I mentioned, with Asia, in terms of oil, Iran's probably one and only end user or consumer is China. So again, there is that tie there. It's only 1 million barrels per day in the grand scheme of, China running, 14 million barrels per day on refinery operations, that sort of thing. So it's not 1 million barrels per day is a small portion of what their total runs, but it's still a significant number. Trying to replace that quickly might prove difficult, and then in all likelihood, they might have to turn to the U.S. to replace that. I'm not sure that China wants to do that, given everything going on with the tariffs and that sort of thing. So, again, any kind of military strike on Iran would probably increase ties between Iran and Asia, particularly China, and potentially with its other Middle East, with the other countries right there in the Middle East around them. Again, depending on what happens, what's hit, the rhetoric around it, and that sort of thing. If Israel were to go off sort of on its own or leading the charge against Iran, I think that puts a different dynamic into it. Again, we're assuming that there's, large casualties, there's military targets and maybe civilian targets that are hit, even if it's unintentional. It's still going to cause outrage, right? So again, let's get into Iran's reaction as I would see it in that scenario. So then I would think maybe larger strikes against Israel. Depending on what the tone and the rhetoric is, on how bad the original attack is, I think it would sort of temper or color the West's reaction to whatever Iran tries to back to it. I'm thinking again back to after the October invasion by Hamas into Israel. We had a brief sort of tit for tat there for a while between Iran and Israel, sort of going back and forth on rockets and drones and that sort of thing. So it seemed like in my perception of it anyway, was that the West was, or the US was sort of allowing some of that to go on, but at the same time still sort of calling up the actors and saying, look, you need to knock this off. You need to de-escalate the situation. So if Iran were to lead an attack on Israel because they're concerned if Israel was able to lead an attack on Iran, especially if they went by themselves, because they're worried that Iran would be ramping up their nuclear capabilities, I think the country of Israel could take a pretty big hit from that just as a retaliatory strike. What happens after that, again, probably not good for anybody. What I wrote here is it could draw Turkey and other Islamic states into a regional war. So Turkey has the largest standing army in the Middle East. So that's, if something happened, and from what I understand, I don't think Turkey and Iran are necessarily best friends, but Turkey and Israel aren't really best friends either, not even close. If something happened that would bring the Turkey and Iranian relationship closer together, especially against sort of a common enemy of Israel, that could be impactful in the region. Other Islamic states, like I mentioned before, with the Saudis seem to be maybe a little more friendly to Iran than they had been previously. Maybe those things start to draw together. You may be aware of some of the negotiations going on or some of the talks going on. It was mainly from the BRICS countries, but then you had Saudi attending them and this sort of thing. So there does seem to be, at least in the background, some sort of coalition of Middle East, Central Asia countries getting together, or Far Asia, I guess, with China, getting together and having more discussions. Whether or not that'll ever come to anything, I don't know, but I think it's something obviously we should keep an eye on one way or the other, is that situation. So then you have, if Iran were to actually draw Turkey to their side, then you're talking about significant armies going up against Israel. The West would have to probably swoop in and hopefully de-escalate the situation, but who knows what will happen. The other interesting thing that could happen would be Russia and China getting involved. So you could, perhaps there's a scenario, maybe a worst case scenario, where because Russia and Ukraine don't seem to be able to come to the table to talk about really ending the war in Ukraine, or the special military operation as Russia sees it, without ending that conflict, and the West sort of maybe keep pushing things on, at least Europe. It seems like Germany is trying to send more advanced weapons to the Ukrainians that could strike Moscow, sort of helping to escalate the situation, not de-escalate the situation. Again, I'm not commenting on who's right and who's wrong. I'm just saying, from an oil perspective, you could see how Russia might get fed up with what's going on in Ukraine. Depending on what the actions were in Iran, maybe they would try to help. Russia does sell quite a bit of natural gas to Iran. There are talks for pipelines going from Iran into the Med that could reach Asia. Again, I don't know that the appetite is there. For Iranian gas to reach into Southern Europe. I don't know the appetite is there in Southern Europe for them to buy Iranian gas. Again, if Iran is seen as the belligerent in the region, definitely not if Iran was seen as somehow being beat up, overly punished by the West. Maybe they do get some sympathy in that department, that sort of thing. So a big enough attack, especially I think if led by Israel alone, could I think really shuffle the deck in the Middle East and in the world and cause more drama that it might need to. But I guess we'll have to wait and see. The other question that is posed quite a bit is, can Iran close the Strait of Hormuz? Well, yes, they could close the Strait of Hormuz. They could sink a ship or, do other things because it's a pretty narrow. Here's the Strait of Hormuz right here. If you're not aware of where that is, but anyway, it is a fairly narrow shipping channel. They could clog it up one way or another and halt shipping. The question yes, they could. Why would they? I guess is the question I would come back with. And just to put some numbers around it, so approximately 70% of OPEC exports, I'm talking about core OPEC, not the OPEC plus, but core OPEC, goes through the Persian Gulf. Around 16 million barrels per day of oil exports went through the Persian Gulf. Again, this is from Petrologistics numbers. I'm rounding up a little bit. But again, thank you to Petrologistics for sending me your data. So that's a pretty huge quantity. So there's obviously other nations in here that are not part of OPEC, at least at the moment, which helps sort of fluff up that number a little bit. Another way to think of it is about 50% of Asia's total liquid demand is, how should I say it, is about 32 million barrels per day. So roughly twice what the amount of oil that, at least crude oil that was exported through the Persian Gulf, at least so far in the month of May. So that's where I'm coming up with that 50% number. Obviously, a lot of that goes to China. So liquid demand, China, you're somewhere around 16 million barrels per day total. India, you're looking at 5.5, 6 million barrels per day of total liquids demand. So that would include NGLs and other things like that on top of crude oil. So just a huge amount of oil flows through there. Yes, obviously, if Iran were to close that, it would cause a huge backup in flows. But again, those flows, not just from Iran, but from the rest of OPEC and the sort of neighboring countries there along the Persian Gulf, most of that oil goes to Asia anyway. And as far as I know, those relationships are all pretty good, right? Between Middle Eastern countries and China, Middle Eastern countries and India, from an oil perspective anyway. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for Iran to close the Persian Gulf and upset their number one customer, being China, in my opinion. I guess if an attack on Iran were bad enough, then maybe they would do it. But we're probably talking about, nuclear war at that point, and probably doesn't make much sense to talk about oil balances anymore. So yes, it's possible. Yes, it would be hugely impactful, but it would also be an interesting scenario where you could see the Chinese Navy and the U.S. Navy working side by side to clear out the wreckage, or however they block the Strait of Hormuz and get that oil flowing again, right? So that probably not something that you would necessarily have on your bingo card, so to speak, for 2025 would be the U.S. Navy and the Chinese Navy working side by side in the Persian Gulf to get oil flowing again, sort of thing. So hopefully that puts some perspective around that issue. It would be a huge deal. I just don't see the point in it. I think it would be, then Iran would be turning these other countries that are at least friendly to them, again, not necessarily saying best friends, but at least friendly to Iran, into total enemies. And so I don't see how that's in Iran's favor. And then finally, here's a long-term view. I changed this to monthly crude futures just to give us a bigger picture. So this goes all the way back to 2010, just in terms of crude oil values. So again, in I believe it was in 2015 when Stuxnet was pulled off. I believe again I think it was the Israelis who did that. So you see, there wasn't like a huge price increase. There was a price increase, but it didn't, go huge. In 2022, we did get a massive rally off of Russia going into Ukraine. And that's sort of where the recent highs are from, is all the uncertainty around what would happen with that situation. So again, for the reasons I illustrated just a few moments ago, in sort of a worst case scenario, yeah, I think we could see a price reaction similar to this. If you were to drag in, Russia and China to the side of Iran to the point where they were sending troops, if Turkey suddenly became allies with Iran to the extent that they're willing to commit troops to go against Israel, that sort of thing, which again I don't necessarily see as being a very high probability at this point. So anyway, hope that helps to maybe start thinking about things. Let me know in the comments different scenarios you were thinking of. Those are the scenarios I came up with. Um, so anyway, keep your eyes on the news this week. It should be, a pretty interesting week. And I'll talk to you later. Bye.